This video is brought to you by thebikestig.com.au, and it's also brought to you by Dry Rider, innovative motorcycle clothing since 1980. You're probably wondering what I'm doing with an inflatable ball here. Well, the reason for that will become apparent in a second. There's a lot of misinformation out there about tyre pressure settings for motorbikes, and the error is primarily caused by the fact that people take racetrack settings and they extrapolate that and apply that to the road. And that may or may not be the case depending on your particular scenario. So in this video, what I want to talk about is tyre pressure settings and give you some information about the relationship between different factors so that you can make an informed decision about the pressure settings that you might utilise. Now, first of all, what we've got to consider is the relationship between stability and traction, because there's a trade-off. As we increase stability, we decrease traction. And as we increase traction, we decrease stability. But there's a third factor that creeps in here, and that is as we increase traction, we increase wear. So think about it this way. Here's the little inflatable ball. This is meant to represent a tyre. So if I have, let's say, X PSI in this tyre, and I apply the load to the motorbike, what's happening is there's a bit of deformation down the bottom here, and that's giving this a contact patch to the seat. And it's this contact patch that gives us traction. The bigger the contact patch, the more traction, obviously. The smaller the contact patch, the less traction. Now, with a certain PSI rating in here, it would deform so much. Now, if I took air out of that tyre, then what would happen is with the application of weight, I'd get more deformation of the tyre, and the contact patch would increase. So what's happening is, as I decrease the PSI for the same weight, the contact patch increases, and the traction, the amount of traction available, increases as well. But in addition to that, we've got to consider the fact that as it's squashing more with less PSI, it's like driving around on a flat tyre. We lose stability. Now the tyre starts to move sideways a lot more. So there's a direct trade-off, or an inverse relationship, I think you would call it. As you increase traction, you decrease stability, and vice versa. And if we were to pump that tyre up very hard, what would happen is we'd get a small contact patch here because we couldn't compress it as much, but we'd get a lot of stability on the rim. So there's this trade-off. But I need you to remember also that as we apply pressure and deform the tyre, the bigger the contact patch, the more wear that's going to occur. So those factors need to be considered as we talk about the settings that we would have for these particular bikes. Now, let's look at the racetrack settings first. I spent some time with Dave Fuller, who's a Pirelli rep in Australia here. And the reason I spoke to him is we've got Pirelli Supercourses fitted to this particular bike, the S1000 RR BMW. And what he told me, or what he advised me to set up, was a hot pressure setting of 34 PSI in the front and 32 PSI in the back. Now, if you've read your manual, and looked at the factory recommendations for tyre pressure settings, they're usually higher in the back and less in the front. The reason we want more in the front in the racetrack conditions is there's much more pressure and weight applied to the front, and severe deformation of the tyre, or deforming potential, because of the severe braking that's occurring. So we want a bit more pressure in the front, and the settings advised to me was 34 hot in the front and 32 hot in the back. Now, in order to achieve that, we set the tyre pressure settings when the tyres are cold. So because there's about, in the conditions that we were riding, is about a 3 PSI change from cold tyres to hot tyres, we set 31 PSI in the front and 29 PSI in the back. When we warm the tyres up, get them to operating temperature, we end up with 34 PSI in the front and 32 PSI in the back. And it sticks like shit to a blanket, right? Just brilliant. Now, your particular scenario is going to be different, and you should be seeking advice from people who know or are in the game, or get information online about that if you're going to do track days and that type of thing. Now, the question is, can we take those settings and apply those to a road bike? Well, that depends very much on your particular circumstances. The first port of call is the manufacturer's recommendation, which in many cases puts the back somewhere up around 38 to 40 PSI cold, and the front a bit less. Now, those tyre settings are there for a reason, because what we've got to remember is that if we're commuting on a day-to-day basis, driving the bike predominantly in a flat line or straight line, what's happening is we're riding on the centre of the tyre more often than the side. And what we don't want to do is wear a big flat spot. So remember, lower pressures, more contact patch, we also increase the amount of wear. So if we're just commuting, we should be sticking to exactly what the factory recommends, because that gives us that best trade-off between stability and traction, and also doesn't accelerate the wear. So we're going to probably get more mileage out of it. And the other thing to remember is, you may have experienced this, is that when you get that flat spot, what happens is you're trying to roll when you go on, let's say you do some range riding after you've worn the tyre into a flat spot, and what happens is you try to turn, you've got to roll the tyre over an edge. And anyone who's ever gone and fitted new tyres and suddenly found the bike wants to lean or fall into a corner will know exactly what I mean. And that's come from a lot of wear occurring in the centre of the tyre. So just to recap, a couple of things. First of all, track pressure settings are there for a reason. We don't care about wear, we only care about traction and ensuring that we don't lose stability on the bike. And those pressure settings are going to be down somewhere in that 28 to 32 psi range, cold tyres. Now, factory recommendations are set up for you to ride the bike in normal day-to-day conditions. You may depart from that, but that depends on the decision-making process that you go through and the type of riding you're going to do. So you need to make an informed decision, and hopefully I've given you sufficient information to do that. Have fun, safe riding.